Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and tonight's guest is returning local author Glenn Allen Cheney, who is going to talk a little bit tonight about some newer, thinner books that he's written, focusing on a couple of the more serious ones. But welcome, Glenn.
Well, it's good to be back, Rana. Thanks for having me.
And I guess maybe you can talk about why you started doing these, like these thin fact books. What was the motivation? I know you've done some pretty in-depth studies of serious topics in the past.
Yeah. I started off writing a book about bees, and I just fell in love with deeply researching a narrow topic for just a couple of months and then writing a book about it. It isn't the deepest book about bees. It just has disparate fact. Each page is a different interesting fact about bees, and I just enjoyed so much, learning so much, so intensely for such a nice little period of time, that I decided to keep going. So I wrote another one about death and burial, and then I wrote one about cats, and then I kind of felt ashamed of myself for writing about something so stupid and frivolous as cats, so I decided to get serious and wrote about the prison situation, which is something that's been bothering me for many years.
Yeah, it's been bothering many of us for many reasons. You know, my own interest in it kind of was sparked about a dozen years ago when I worked for Head Start, and one year I had a caseload of 12 students, and these are 3-year-olds, and 4 of them had incarcerated parents.
Oh.
And in 3 of the cases, both parents were incarcerated, and these children, very young kids, were living with other relatives, and in a kind of precarious situation. The relatives were well-meaning, but not necessarily able to take care of grandkids, niece, nephews. DCF was supervising in theory, but really they weren't. One of the children lost erroneously. Her Medicaid coverage was taken away, and none of these parents were in for more than nonviolent drug crimes. Yeah. And it just seemed a really bad idea. At the same time, I knew a lot of families who were not New London families, who were not Latino families, whose parents did use drugs and whose kids were not orphans.
Yeah. Well, when people consider the cost of incarceration, they often, or they never, look at what they call collateral punishment, which is the punishment rendered on children and spouses and all of the financial loss that results from, inevitably, if one bread earner goes into prison, then the family's going to go broke. They're not going to be able to pay their rent or pay their house, and when you go bankrupt, people don't get paid. That's what bankruptcy is, people not getting paid. And children have and I don't remember the numbers, but they're in this book, a much higher chance of going to prison themselves if their parents have gone to prison, and they tend to get depressed. The suicide rate is higher, and of course, when people are in prison, they aren't working and making, paying taxes. And the cost of keeping a prisoner in prison in Connecticut, in the state prison, is $62,000 a year. But that's just the cost of, housing and taking care of the guy. Yeah, but there are all these other costs that never get recorded, that we have no way of measuring, but they are certainly out there.
That point about a lot of what we're doing economically in our towns, in our state, in our country, we're not getting a complete gauge of what the damage is. Even thinking about like economic development, or when you have projects, are you displacing people? Are you disrupting social ties? Are you taking people away from, being close to where they work? And we're not really good at that whole big picture piece of it. So you mentioned these books, although they're thin, that they're heavily researched. So what kind of research, where did you do your research for this book on incarceration?
Well, I would typically, not exclusively, but typically go to Wikipedia and look up a topic. I would start with incarceration. And as you read the article about incarceration, there are links to other articles dealing with incarceration. And each link, each article in Wikipedia has all the footnotes, all the reports and studies. So I would go from that to the studies, most of which are available online. So I would, get the studies and read them. So I'm not just reciting what's in Wikipedia, but going back to the sources. And there's always, any topic you want to take up, there's something really interesting and fascinating about it. And certainly in prison, although there wasn't much good news regarding prisons, I'll tell you that. It was really depressing. So, let me tell you what my original idea was with the prison book, and this goes back 25 years. I wanted to get the experts in the country to each write a little chapter about some aspect of prisons, what the problems are and what the solutions are. And I put out a call for papers to prisons and magazines and organizations and such. Got no response whatsoever, except one guy who had been in prison, and he was out and sounded like an intelligent. I didn't ask him what he'd done or anything, but he sounded like an intelligent person. And he said, "You're not going to find anybody to write about that. Nothing will be done. Nobody's going to do anything." And he was right. Nobody would volunteer to write something about prisons, problems, or solutions. So I started to do it myself.
When you say that, it doesn't surprise me. I sort of got into it not just because of my experience working with kids of incarcerated parents, but you might remember in 2005, Cliff Thornton ran for governor of Connecticut on the Green ticket, and drug policy reform was his big issue. And incarceration is, of course, a piece of that. And the way I met him was that I was part of the Southeast Connecticut Peace and Justice Network. This was the early 2000s. And there was sort of a split in the group. There were the people like you and me, the older white leftist peaceniks who had been protesting wars since the 60s. Yeah. And then there was another group that was a little younger, perhaps, people of color who really wanted us to push us to deal with justice at home. And, if there's without justice, you can't have peace. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't know much about what they had experienced. And I started asking them if they'd be on the show. This was back in 2004 or 2005. And there were a few of them locally, and none of them would come on the show for different reasons. One worked, was an employee within Connecticut's criminal justice system and thought she'd lose her job. Another one had some health problems. There were all these reasons why they wouldn't come and talk about it for 50 minutes. And so I went to the internet, of course, drug policy reform or criminal justice reform Connecticut. And I came up with Cliff Thornton's website, which is called Efficacy. And I was really impressed. And I sent him an email. And he answered about 10 minutes later and said, "You've got great timing. I'm going to New Haven today to talk to the Green Party about running for governor on this platform." So he did, a few weeks later, come onto the show and talk about how our drug policy has been damaging, in so many ways, and what we can or should do about it. So in a way, I guess not much has changed, that people who have intimate knowledge inside the system are not going to want to go public very much. Yeah,
we have a huge bureaucracy. And also, as if the government bureaucracy isn't bad enough, you've got the government bureaucracy, you've got the unions that are, defending their jobs. And then you've got our shift to the private prison. What do they call it? The PIC, prison industrial complex. And that's really an awful thing, where corporations now have an interest in putting people in jail. Governments, hire companies to establish a prison or to work within a government prison. But the contracts often require minimum occupancy. In one case, it was 96%. The government has to fill 96% of the beds in the prison. which means, how do you do that? Well, you have longer sentences and mandatory sentences, and maybe even, you know, not exactly promote recidivism, but not try to prevent it, and anything that would prevent recidivism is going to be, you know, suppressed a little bit, and it's a really awful situation. The United States now leads the world in per capita and absolute numbers of prisoners.
And
2.3 million people. In fact, in Florida, 10% of the voting population of Florida cannot vote because they have been in prison. 10%.
And they're permanently disenfranchised.
Permanently.
In Connecticut, at least, there is a way to get re-enfranchised, but that isn't true in all states.
That's right. I think there's only a couple of states where, there are a couple of states where prisoners can vote even while they're in prison.
Which actually they should be able to.
I don't see why not. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that says, well, actually, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have a right to vote.
Oh. So there aren't really protections in place.
Right. You can't deny it because of race or, you know, religion and all of those things, but there's nothing in there that says that you can deny somebody the right to vote because they're in prison or have been in the past. I don't know why that's not a Supreme Court issue.
I don't know. And you look at the prison population, and, you know, the percentages from, you know, the black community, the brown community,
Mm-hmm.
are much higher than the white community. So it's almost a suppression of electoral power for anyone but us white people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's certainly the case in Florida, where most of that 10% are, just so happens to be, you know, some of the browner
Yeah,
colors.
which perhaps was one cause of our presidential results in 2000.
Oh, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. We would have had a
that-
different president if those people had been allowed to vote.
Yeah, so the disenfranchisement of voters has huge consequences for our country. So I looked at the first couple of pages of the book online, and it seemed to start like, what's the day of a prisoner look like? Because you talk a little about what the real experience is, and most of us are pretty clueless about that.
Yeah, I don't know that much about the exactly what goes on, but there is an interesting little chapter. Each chapter here is about a page long, but there is something kind of interesting about what do you do when it's your first day and you go to your cell and there's a guy standing there, or, you know, a woman, depending. There's a chapter here called Meet and Greet. What do you do in that situation? And the chapter says, welcome to your new home. It may not be as spacious as you like, but at least you'll have someone to talk to. You may not be escorted to your cell. A guard will give you a cell number and point the way. If you can't find your cell, find someone who looks like you and ask where to go. The first thing you have to do is meet your new roomie. This will be a big moment for both of you, and perhaps a little awkward. The thing to do upon arrival is knock on the door. If there's someone inside, introduce yourself thus. My name's Bob. Sorry, Bob, or any other name. My name's Bob.
Happens to Bobs all the time.
Yeah. My name's Bob. They told me to bunk here. If there's no one there, go in, but don't touch anything. Don't lie on a bunk. Just wait. Stand up to introduce yourself.
Wow.
Etc. Yeah, that's something I never thought of, that first moment when you walk in and you're going to be living with somebody for years.
And imagine how that must feel for all first-timers.
Yeah. I just can't imagine being in prison. I couldn't take it. I don't know.
Well, I guess some people take it only because they have to.
Well, there aren't many volunteer prisoners in the world, no. But a really big issue is who should be in prison. Why we put people in prison. And there are 4 basic reasons, if I can remember the 4. And one is to deter other criminals, which obviously is not working very well because the criminals are still doing what criminals do. And for much the same reason. Every criminal figures, I'm not going to get caught. And then at least some of them do. And there's also to teach people a lesson, which is really, you know, vengeance. And this is one of the main This is the big issue as far as, after all this research, this is what I see as the big issue, is whether prisons are for vengeance, which I can certainly understand and sympathize with. If you've had a loved one beaten up or murdered or something, you're going to feel the desire. That person's got to suffer. The trouble is, most prisoners eventually get released. They go back into the community, and the more they have suffered in prison, the more likely they're going to commit a crime on the outside. Putting somebody in jail for 10 years doesn't deter them twice as much as 5 years. So the more we exact vengeance on somebody, the more we threaten public safety. So which is better, to have that good feeling of vengeance, or to maybe not have, not really inspire criminals to go on doing what they do?
I think in this country, vengeance is a big thing, because in the Michael Moore movie, Who Do We Invade Next? He talks about the prisons in Norway, which are quite humane places compared to the United States and most of the world, I guess. And I won't say I'd like to be incarcerated anywhere, but it seems as though their goal is,
do it in Norway.
Yes. But their goal is that when people are released, they will be reformed, and they'll still be caring human beings, maybe more so than they were when they came in. And I can just imagine Americans saying, I don't want my tax money to give these prisoners a more plush life than I have.
Right. There is something, I'm trying to find the right page here, about that prison in Norway. And the principle at that prison is, here in this country, we treat prisoners like children. We tell them everything to do. They're very restricted. They can't have certain things because they might hurt themselves or hurt other people. In Norway, the idea is, let them be adults. Teach them to be adults. They have to think ahead. They have to take responsibility for what they do. If they want to have food, they have to go out and plant it. And they have to think about, in the spring, think about what they're going to be eating in November. And these prisons don't have bars. There's no fence. You could run. They let these prisoners, all right, so they teach them to work with wood. How do they do that? They have to go down and cut down a tree. They start with the tree.
Wow.
They give these prisoners chainsaws and tell them, if you want to, have a decent life, you're going to have to make some furniture. You're going to have to go down and cut that tree. Here's a chainsaw. Go do it. Be careful. And in this way, they learned, so they could run away. But they do a little thinking, and they think, if I run away, I'm going to end up back in that really bad. They do have bad prisons there, and people earn, the prisoners earn their right to be in this freer, more comfortable situation. And so basically, they are training themselves to be responsible, to think ahead, to not just run off because they can get away with it. And it seems to be working a lot better than our system of destroying people as human beings practically. It's almost the intent is to make people not think ahead, and to just fear and hate.
Yeah, it's worse than really treating them like children. It's like treating them like children in an abusive family.
Yeah, right.
Or at the very least, in a very authoritarian family.
Right, and we know how children from families like that turn out.
Some of them end up in prison. It's,
exactly.
Or in the military, they're, environments where they don't make their own decisions.
Now, you brought up a good issue about taxpayers, and I can certainly sympathize with people. All right, so in some prisons, prisoners can get a college education, even from an Ivy League school, while they're in prison, and that costs money. They have to pay the professors to go in there and teach them. And some taxpayers say, wait a minute, my kid can't go to college. We don't have enough money, and that prisoner is going to go to college. Well, how is this fair? How is this right? Well, it comes down again to vengeance or public safety. Prisoners who come out with a college degree or have taken a bunch of courses are much less likely to end up committing a crime and ending up back in jail and costing taxpayers even more money.
And looking at things in a broader way, our country spends a lot of money on the military, like the prisons. We're #1 in the world in spending on in the military, so that we're way out of scale with everyone else. And if we change some of our spending habits, we actually could help all these other people afford to send their kids to college.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Well, you know, if it costs $62,000 to keep a prisoner in prison in Connecticut, and by the way, in New York City, it's about $145,000 per year. But for every prisoner we've got in prison, we could hire a teacher. And would an additional teacher keep one kid out of jail? You know, a good possibility of that would be true.
Yeah, and a year in a university, not, you know, that $65,000 would do pretty well towards that.
Exactly. High school dropouts are 63 times more likely to end up incarcerated than people with a bachelor's degree.
Well, it makes sense if you don't have the skills to find legitimate work. And, you know, I really do feel bad for the poor millennials because they, you know,
they have to turn to crime.
Finding entry-level jobs that you can kind of live on is not easy right now. But if you can't, people are going to try to survive. So if you can't find a legitimate job, you're going to find some other way.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, when I worked for Head Start, there were some of the parents who did things under the table, not, you know, things like buying shoes for cheap in New York and like selling them here.
And not paying a sales tax or something.
And like not really having a vendor's license and all these, some of them might have also been involved in, you know, illegal stuff. I'm not sure. Yeah. I didn't ask questions about that. But
well, the book talks quite a bit about women in prison. The number of women in prison has been rising steadily over the years, and most of their crimes have been something to do with supporting the family. Even if it's selling drugs because they can't pay the rent or their kids are hungry or something. They aren't selling drugs and getting rich driving around in Mercedes-Benz. You know, they're trying to sustain their families.
Well, I think, you know, and a piece of this is probably some of them have left abusive relationships.
Oh, yeah.
And we know that there isn't really a good safety net for most women of low socioeconomic status. If they, well, even higher socioeconomic status, really, if they leave the breadwinner of the household because they can't take the abuse, it's sometimes really hard for them to live.
Yeah. And many women, those women who are in jail because of violence, it's usually violence against someone who has been abusing them.
Yeah, the courts aren't always kind to those women.
Well, you know, I mean, you're not supposed to just take the law into your own hands. But on the other hand, how can you can be pushed just so far before something like that. The point really is, if you let them out of prison, they would probably never hurt anybody for the rest of their lives. They were in a situation where they were driven to violence. I'm not saying they're innocent or shouldn't, receive some kind of training or assistance or something like that. But why keep them locked up? Just for vengeance? Because they aren't there for public safety reasons in most cases.
Because in most cases, they wouldn't really threaten anyone else.
Exactly. And meanwhile, of course, their kids are now in the foster care system and, subject to all kinds of abuse or at least neglect or not enough love, actual love. And locking a mother up in jail doesn't really do anybody any good.
Yeah.
And then there's women who give birth in prison, and there's women who give birth in shackles, which I just can't believe. Even where it is, a state government has said, no, if she's giving birth, you can take the shackles off. She's not going anywhere. But they do it anyway. Yeah. Even though it was legislatively prohibited, they do it anyway.
So what kind of oversight is there in terms of like laws governing how people are treated in prison? How is it enforced?
I can't answer that very accurately, but there are certainly cases, innumerable cases of abuse in prison, and you know, in cases where there's been abuse of prisoners, who are you going to believe? The guard who says, I didn't do it, or, you know, he just fell down the stairs, and I don't mean to pick on guards here, because it's an awful job, and, you know, I'm sure the vast majority of them, the vast majority of the time, they're not doing anything wrong. But when something does occur, how do you find out?
You really can't.
You can't, and you know, I'm not saying, and I don't think there's widespread abuse, but it does occur.
Now, what kind of things did you discover, well, besides women giving birth in shackles, that kind of surprised you?
Oh, every page, well, if it didn't surprise me, then I didn't put it in the book. Everything in here is something that surprised me, and, let me just, there's a little chapter, I'm not going to go through this whole chapter, but the perfect gift for someone who has nothing. What do you send to somebody in prison? Yeah, and then there's solitary confinement, which is certainly a form of torture, and it leads to, you know, all kinds of, I mean, not just depression, but hallucination. There was a prison director, a warden, who voluntarily went into solitary confinement, and he was in there for about a day, and he couldn't take it. And some people are in there for months, even years.
And then when
a lot of them.
Yeah, and then I'm guessing, so if people go in and when they're released, they're in worse shape than they were when they went in.
Yep.
You know.
They did a study of, they looked at 54,000 inmates who had spent time in solitary. Of those, 29% had been in there for 1 to 3 months. 3 months locked up, no books or anything, and you lose track of what time is, and 11% endured 3 continuous years or more in isolation.
So what is the point of that? And
yeah.
I mean, with no books or other communication
I think you can have a Bible in some cases. But
I do wonder what's the stated purpose of it, even if that stated purpose really isn't accurate.
Yeah.
I guess
it might be for the prisoner's own safety or safety of other prisoners, but that really doesn't seem like the right way to solve these problems. I'm sure it just aggravates them.
And I'm guessing some things like, you know, books, that doesn't really jeopardize people's safety. There might be some prisoners who shouldn't have roommates.
You want to hear about books? I'm glad you brought up books. Now what page?
I couldn't help but think about books.
Banned books. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice banned some 10,000 books from its prison system. Among the prohibited titles, A Charlie Brown Christmas pop-up edition, The Color Purple, Memoirs of a Geisha, To Kill a Mockingbird, MapQuest Road Atlas, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart Presents America, A Citizen's Guide to Democracy, Women Behind Bars, Where's Waldo, Game of Thrones, Dante's Inferno, the 1908 Sears Roebuck Catalog. These are, and guess what you can read? And other books by Noam Chomsky, Jenna Bush, John Grisham, Langston Hughes, Philip Roth, Salman Rushdie, Studs Terkel, Sojourner Truth. Okay. Guess what you can read there? Lolita, Mein Kampf, David Duke's My Awakening.
Oh, man.
That's Texas, and there's similar cases here in Connecticut. There's a whole list of books that seem reasonable to me, but they won't let you have them in prison.
I can't imagine what the criteria would be. I mean,
well,
Charlie Brown Christmas, really.
Yeah, that I can't. I can't imagine what that is. Maybe they can use it as a weapon or something. I don't know. Usually, they don't want anything that's going to bring out feelings of racism or instigate violence. So I don't know how Lolita can be in there, but
yeah, or Mein Kampf. That actually did instigate a little bit of violence.
Yes.
So you'd think that wouldn't really fit the bill, but you know, I do wonder what people are empowered to make those lists and what bases they're using to judge
The Color
books.
Purple. I mean, these are books that would help people become more empathetic with others. You would think that would be something they would want people to read.
Okay, so you started out way back in the beginning talking about 4 reasons we incarcerate people, and I think we only got to the first 2.
Yeah, and I couldn't remember what the other 2 were. No, I don't know.
Well,
We got distracted,
We did.
and now I'm going to have to remember which ones I
So
talked about. And
we talked about vengeance, of course,
vengeance and deterrence.
and deterrence, both of which are on shaky ground.
Mm-hmm. And I'll think of the others here in a second, as soon as I find the right page. You had to bring that up, didn't you?
I did.
Let's do a commercial. Can we do a commercial?
No, I mean, I could distract more.
I mean, the 4 are perfectly obvious once you know what they are. There's a whole section.
I'm guessing one of them is just to get people out of society.
Exactly, yep. Isolation.
And maybe we succeed. I mean, I don't know what the long-term value of that, but I guess incarceration does really accomplish that while it lasts.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, some prisoners have to be isolated from society. That's just, they can't be walking around, but believe me, it's in here somewhere.
Okay. So people will just have to read the book to find out what number 4 is.
Yes. Correction, of course.
Oh.
I think that's the 4th one, correction or rehabilitation, which we aren't doing very well either.
No, in fact, it seems like we might be worse at that than any of the others.
Oh, yeah. Not only is bad for the prisoners, but as I was saying, their kids and their wives and their communities all become worse because somebody got sent to prison.
And unfortunately, I would guess, I'm not sure about this, that there are some communities, some zip codes that have a fairly high percent of their typical residents incarcerated, and other zip codes where they don't. And
right.
we have a census coming up in a couple years, and it in the U.S. and it's been a little bit of controversy about asking people's immigration status, and one of the fears is that people will just underreport. They won't turn in a questionnaire, and communities where they live will be underrepresented in Congress,
Exactly.
So
it's called prison gerrymandering is the term for it. But yeah, where do you count? Does somebody live where the prison is, or does somebody live where they used to live in a community?
And in Connecticut, they live where the prison is, right?
I think so, yeah.
So a community like New London, which might have a higher percentage of incarcerated individuals than Waterford, right across the border,
Right.
might actually have its population numbers depressed and not get adequate aid, not get adequate representation. It's like really a huge trickle-down effect of on so many different levels.
Yep.
So I guess we should talk a little bit about, when you were researching this, are there solutions in sight? What can we be doing in the long term, and what can we as individuals do a little bit about now?
Yeah, there was certainly no. I didn't see any silver bullet solutions that will automatically, just solve the problem. But there are many. Certainly, one, unquestionably, is education inside the prison. Drug treatment inside prisons would help, and ideally, drug rehabilitation outside of prisons. There's really no reason. There's a large number of people who become addicted in the prisons,
Right.
and they weren't when they went in there in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm guessing our attitude towards drug treatment out of the prison would really help a lot. It would keep people out.
Right. And, and things like mandatory sentences that put people in prison longer than they have to be for no real benefit at all.
Just to meet the quotas.
Yeah,
Maybe.
sometimes to make the quota, or just because, citizens get tough on crime, and who doesn't want to be tough on crime? And so they end up generating more crime by trying to be tough on it.
Well, thinking about, the drug issue, the connection with, drug use, abuse, and addiction, and incarceration, I often want to point out that, there are a lot of us in the United States who are addicted to things that are readily available, and we manage to be productive citizens. I mean, there are a lot of people who smoke cigarettes who are addicted. There are a lot of us who smoke coffee, who drink coffee, which is a relatively mild drug. But if you miss a day, you notice it.
Yeah.
If you're chronic.
So the first thing you do is go out and rob a bank to get some more coffee money.
Well, you know, we are lucky. It's easy to get. It's pretty affordable. We're not going to have to rob a bank to buy a cup of coffee in the current economy. And we even have enough choices that we can buy it organic or fairly traded or shade grown. But in a way, we are maintaining an addiction, and yet there are some drugs that there's really no opportunity for people to maintain an addiction outside of prison that where the rest of their life can be productive because they know that they don't have to have their whole life surrounded around getting hold of the substance. Yeah.
Well, my book doesn't. I tried to avoid sentencing and what should be a crime and things like that. But I had something to say, and now I've forgotten what it was.
Well, while you think about that, while we're on the subject, I have a poster here, and when Glenn and I were talking before the show, Drew was helpful enough to bring us this poster. There is currently a prison arts program that's being displayed in various buildings affiliated with the Guard Arts Center, in the lobby, in the Guard Gallery, and also in the Main Street office. And it's going to be running for another couple weeks. It's open during weekends. The ones that are in the Guard lobby, I think whenever the box office is open, you'd be able to go in and see them. And it would just, but most of it is in the Guard Gallery, 305 State Street. And it's open Thursday, Friday, Saturday from 11 a.m. On Thursday to 7, Friday to 5, Saturday to 3, and by appointment. We've missed the reception by a few weeks, so we can't do that. But yes, there's work from the prison arts program. So at least in Connecticut, one positive thing that is happening is that some inmates are doing art. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that is good for prisoners, it turns out. I mentioned all the many different, solutions. One of them is being able to express yourself creatively, or there are courses on how to write so that prisoners can deal with their own lives by writing about it.
Yeah, I'm guessing a lot of them never did have that opportunity.
Yeah, and prison visits is something else. If the more prisoners are allowed to see their families and vice versa, the fewer the problems for the prisoner and for the families, the less likely the children will end up committing a crime or doing poorly in school or killing themselves. And there's a little chapter in here called Another Bad Idea, and the bad idea is to let the visitations only be by video camera, which in some cases might be good because somebody could be at home and over the computer communicate and see their, mommy or daddy who's in prison. But they're trying to use that to replace visits, which cost money because you've got to, deal with actual, flesh and bones coming in the front door. But it isn't nearly the same to see daddy on a screen as opposed to being able to, actually see him.
Yeah, especially for very young kids who really, the world is very 3D for them still.
Mm-hmm. Plus, of course, the families have to pay money for that video connection. They're not going to let you just do it for free. You've got to, it's going to cost you something.
Well, how money figures into the whole equation is really interesting to me because there are some things we just don't want to spend money on, like visitations or education or art lessons. But we spend a whole lot of money putting people in this prison system, which, as you said, costs over $60,000 a year in Connecticut. People, many of whom would really not present a public risk and it would be much more cheaper for them to get whatever mental health services they need, drug treatment services they need, outside of the prison walls and be able to live in their own homes. So
yes, and take care of their families, and I mean, you know, it's easy to think that prisoners are just cutthroat, bloodthirsty, hate everybody, violent people, but you know what? They're mommies and daddies, and they love their kids. Not all of them. There are some really bad people in prison, but most of them haven't really done anything wrong.
And I'm thinking that if you look at what other percentages of incarceration are in other countries around the world, we might be able to get a better sense of like how many people there are who really do need to be isolated.
Yeah, and I don't have those numbers. And
no,
that would be
but
interesting
I'm
to
sure
find out. But certainly more than half are in you know, because of drug. And the number's in the book, and I don't remember it. But
yeah.
More than half are in there for drug-related crimes that, you know, when you think about, this is what I forgot before that I wanted to say, when you think about it, being arrested for using drugs, we make drugs illegal because if you use them, then you're going to go on and commit a crime. But most people don't, especially marijuana.
Yeah.
In fact, they don't have the initiative to get up and commit a crime.
Right.
But we end up arresting people not because of a crime, not because they've done anything wrong, but because they might do something wrong. And that's a really awful principle to have underlying your legal system.
Right.
To be incarcerated for what you might do.
And it's a perception more than a reality what you might do.
That too, yes.
Because honestly, alcohol is legal and regulated, and I'm guessing is at the root of more crime than cannabis.
I would think it probably is.
You know, and looking at the example of Portugal, which I don't think of as being a radical country in general, you know, conservative Catholic country, but, you know, a dozen years ago, they decriminalized drug use, and both drug use and crime went down.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So, you know, we've learned that what we're doing, we're throwing money at the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So, do you have any last thoughts about, you know, this book before we spend a little bit of time on Lurking Doubt?
Lurking Doubt, Notes on Incarceration.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one very interesting concept discussed in the book, and that is restorative justice. This is something else that might go a long way toward improving the incarceration situation. Restorative justice tries to bring together the criminal and the victims, and so that they can talk to each other and understand each other a little bit, maybe inspire some empathy in the prisoner, and among the victims too, and try to achieve an understanding and prepare people psychologically to go back into the community and get people to understand that they're part of a community, that all of us should be serving a community in some way.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because, you know, tonight there's a public hearing in New London on the school budget. And one thing the New London schools are piloting right now is a restorative justice approach in the middle school. I think Safe Futures is, you know, the contractor facilitating some of these restorative circles among the students, so that, you know, rather than punitive discipline in the schools, and it is the hope that eventually, you know, especially in a town that has a large minority population, that we really take a different approach and be less punitive, and start that empathy and communication when kids are small, and not wait until, you know, they're adults who grew up without this skill set.
Right, yeah, the earlier we get in there and teach people to be better parts of their community, the better.
Okay, now
let me talk about this. Enough about prisons. Let's talk about something cheery. I wrote a book here called The Merry Burial Compendium.
So we'll talk about death.
It's about death.
Okay, now how did you become involved in, like, interest in this?
In death? Well, I'll tell you. Thank you for asking. I am on the board of directors of an organization called Connecticut Green Burial Grounds, ctburialgrounds.org. And our mission is to establish cemeteries where people can be buried basically organically. That is to say, no coffin unless it's of simple, unvarnished, unpainted pine or a native wood, or just a shroud of natural material, and no embalming, of course, no vault underground, and what we would like to do is find unforested land that is not agricultural land, and let people plant a tree right over their body, so that they can literally, so that they're, this is why we call it the Merry Burial Compendium, because the idea is to turn the body into a physically present living thing.
And be part of the whole compost cycle.
Exactly. And the body literally becomes the tree. And rather than going to a cemetery and looking at a cold piece of stone standing there, you can go there and look at a tree and just think that your loved one has become that entity.
And it is interesting to me because the Orthodox Jews do use sometimes pine boxes, sometimes poplar, but
it doesn't have to be pine,
wood,
but
that are doweled together. They don't have metal nails or metal hinges, and shroud.
Yeah. There are also caskets of made right here in Connecticut, made of woven willow or what do you call that?
I don't know. Yeah.
Huh? Hemp? That's a good idea. Well, it could be hemp, but yeah.
So, so tell us about. We only have about 5 minutes, but tell us about how the organization got started and what people can do.
Oh, all right. Well, it got started with a former New London resident, a registered nurse, Elizabeth Foley, who's our chairman, and we pulled together a really, really excellent board of people who are in some way. We got a couple of funeral directors on the board. Funeral directors love this idea, believe it or not. You'd think that they would be interested in, all the money involved in embalming and stuff, and they will certainly do that. But they also know how ugly embalming is, and the idea of making a body so that it will not rot, and putting it into a box that is designed not to rot, and putting that inside a concrete vault.
And cemeteries, as they are pretty polluted.
Yeah, eventually this stuff, it takes centuries, but eventually this stuff ends up back in the ground. It's far more, a green burial, people worry about contaminating groundwater and such, and if you're just 5 or 6 feet away from it, there's no contamination whatsoever. As opposed to, carcinogens, formaldehyde and stuff that just exists forever. So anyway, we decided that we have to change this. There is one hybrid cemetery in Danbury where they have, what's the word? Regular burials, but you can have a green burial there too in one. I think it's over in one section. But there is no exclusively green burial ground anywhere in the state, or for that matter, in neighboring states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire. I don't think any of these states have a exclusively green burial ground.
So you had mentioned that land is the problem. So what kind of real estate do you need?
Yeah, land is the problem because, as anyone knows, land in Connecticut is not cheap, and it's also densely populated, and places that aren't populated tend to be very steep or have a high bedrock or wetlands all over the place. So it's hard to find a place that would be appropriate for a burial at any kind of affordable price. We've got some money. We did a fundraiser and raised quite a bit of money, and we can buy some land, but it's so far we've been looking for about a year, and we have not found land that will work. We want to be, many cemeteries are right downtown, right next to a church. We're looking for something in a bucolic rural area, no houses around, and we want to build a spiritual center, a chapel type of thing, and a place where people can go and sit under their tree and, celebrate life in a cemetery.
So if people want to find out more, we have 2 minutes now, how can they find out more about it or get involved in some way, or maybe let you know if they know of leads on land? Yeah,
exactly. We need leads on land, if anybody knows. I guess the best place to start is the good old internet. CT, as in Connecticut, CT Green Burial Grounds, plural.org, or just Google, Green Burial Connecticut, and you'll come up with us.
Is there any other organization in Connecticut that's looking to do this, or
Not
are
at all.
you the trailblazers?
We are
in
the
our
only
state?
ones in Connecticut right now. And there's one group in Massachusetts also trying to find some land, and they haven't yet. I don't know what's going on in Rhode Island, but there was a recent thing in the New York Times, I don't remember the exact number, but something like 75% of Americans would consider a green burial if it were an option.
And you've written some columns in the Day. You had an opinion piece,
That's right.
and in the Connecticut Mirror. Have you gotten public responses to that at all?
Yeah, in fact, within a few days of the article, the op-ed in the Day, somebody who operates a Jewish burial ground in Norwich offered us a whole area where we could have green burials, which is basically, as you said,
Very
basically
similar
the same
to what
as,
they're doing anyway.
yeah, Jewish, and I might
I
mention
mean, they do
Muslim
have the
burials.
stones, but not the
Yeah,
trees.
right.
But
So anyway, we went and looked at that area, and of course the wetlands were too close, and it didn't quite work out. But you know, that was a case of almost getting it and not quite. We've come almost, but there's always something that doesn't work out.
well, there are a lot of little corners in Connecticut, so
There are.
hopefully
We will find something
something will turn up. Well, thank you, Glenn, for coming on again.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Didn't ask
even
me about
though,
cats.
oh yeah,
Oh,
we
never
didn't
mind.
talk about cats or bees
Right.
this time, but you know, it wasn't really too heavy, even though it was incarceration and death.
right.
It sounds a lot less cheery than it
Yes.
was. So thanks very much. Next week, Lindsay Gillette from OutCT is going to be on and talk about the programs that OutCT has coming up. And thanks again, Glenn, for coming on. We'll have to do it again in fall.
Oh, let's please do it soon, yes.
Yeah, that
I'm
would be
always happy to
great.
come back to New London.
Well, yeah, someday maybe we'll get you to move back to New London.
I keep trying.
It'll happen.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, nimpenda mzuri sana. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, nimpenda mzuri sana. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika. Oh, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, yo, nimpenda mzuri sana. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana. Oh, tuimbe Afrika, yo, tuimbe Afrika, piga ngoma yako mama, tusale muziki mingi. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana. Oh, tucheze muziki sana, piga makofi wewe, ngoma na ngoma yetu wewe, wote ndani kuwaga. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, Afrika, yo. Oh, Sana Africa, Sana Africa.